Welcome to the Climate Change, Organized Labor, and the Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic Perspectives from Europe and the US. I'm very happy to have this discussion today. I'm Larry Williams Jr. I'm the founder of UnionBase.org. Just for reference, my introduction to the Transatlantic dialogue was about maybe a year ago. I met the really amazing folks at TSD, and ever since then, I've been trying to participate in these conversations as much as possible, particularly around just transition. It's my personal belief, being someone who has done work in the labor movement, done work in the environmental movement, in the technology world, that there are challenges that we're facing right now that present super important and once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to change the way the economy and the way we are involved with nature. We've had some of the problems that exist now, but now they're exacerbated because of the scale of problems like climate change and obviously COVID-19. I also want to recognize that at this time, a lot of people probably have burnout from discussion around COVID. So this discussion, I think, is going to be a breath of fresh air for folks. We got really exciting speakers from across the world, from different perspectives and different expertise. And I see myself as just trying to facilitate this conversation, keep it going, and make sure that folks' questions get answered. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to do a little bit of explanation of what this session is, what sessions we have coming up, just a little information for you. I'm going to read just a little bit about each person's expertise, and then each presenter is going to do a presentation from between 8 to 10 minutes. They may have something to present to you, or they may just be, sharing verbally. Either way, try not to multitask, try to focus on what they're saying, because I guarantee you each of these people has very specific expertise and brilliance that you're going to want to hear and want to learn from. Okay. All right. So just for information's sake, this is the first in a series of fall webinars that together for this spring take place as this year's Transatlantic Social Dialogue. The next one is Monday, the 19th, and looks at the transformation of working in manufacturing. The TSD is in its 18th year and typically takes the form of a small meeting in which we discuss challenges facing the labor movement and innovative strategies to address them. The co-sponsors of TSD are the Worker Institute, an Ithaca collab at the ILR School, as well as the European Trade Institute and Hans Bockler Foundation, and the IG Metall Union, Information is available on the website of the ILR Ithaca Collab. And lastly, since this is in Zoom meeting format, we want to remind you that you please turn off your mic if you're not speaking. This is a format where you can ask questions. There's a question and answer button at the bottom there. It should say Q&A. So please submit your questions there, and we're going to try to get to those at the end. I think we should have a pretty good amount of time to do some question and answer at the end. We will not be using the chat function, so don't put it there because we probably won't see it. All right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce folks. I believe we have all of our speakers here. Excellent. And our first speaker is Lara Skinner, who is co-executive director of the Wisconsin, pardon me, her position has changed. I want to make sure I get this correct. She's transitioning. She was previously with the Worker Institute, but she's transitioning to focus on labor leading on climate work and shifting the Worker Institute's leadership to her wonderful colleague, Patricia Campos Medina. Welcome, Lara, and we're really happy to have you in this conversation, and it's nice to see you back.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, and I'm still with the Worker Institute. I'm co-executive director of the Worker Institute, along with Patricia Campos Medina, and leading the labor leading on climate work at the Worker Institute. So Larry, do you want me to go now, or will you be introducing all of the speakers?
I'd like you to go first, and I think it's really great to have you lead off. You have a high level perspective of what's happening in this work, so I'd love to hear from you on this topic.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Larry, and thanks to the European Trade Union Institute and Hans Bockler Stiftung and IG Metall for co-hosting this October webinar with the Worker Institute at Cornell's ILR School. Really appreciate it. And as Larry mentioned, I'm the co-executive director of the Worker Institute at Cornell's ILR School, and I run an initiative called Labor Leading on Climate. And we study the labor and employment impacts of climate change and energy policy. And we also provide research, training, policy, and education support to unions and worker organizations on climate change and clean energy. And at the Worker Institute, we began convening unions after Hurricane Sandy. Mijin was involved in this work as well. And we really were working with unions to help them to develop an ambitious climate protection agenda that would drive high quality job creation and economic development. And in the process of doing that work, we realized really two important things that I'll mention here and that I think are important to today's conversation. One, that we were facing two crises, not just one, right? That we have an accelerating crisis of climate change, but we also have a growing crisis of inequality. And that includes inequality in all of its forms, inequality of income, wealth, race, power, and much more. And the second thing we recognize is that having the labor movement play a leading role in addressing and finding solutions to the climate crisis is absolutely essential. And that labor really needs to be on the forefront of developing solutions that can address both of these crises. And I think those realizations that we had after Hurricane Sandy, when we convened those unions, are even more important as we see the climate crisis worsen, as we see the COVID-19 global health pandemic both highlight and deepen the dangerous levels of inequality that currently exist in the US, and as we find ourselves in this economic crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And like COVID-19, I think about climate change as a major public health and economic crisis that's layered on top of the crisis of inequality that we already face. In other words, the most vulnerable in our society, women, immigrants, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and low-income families are hurt first and worst by climate change. And most importantly, I think both the COVID-19 crisis and the current racial justice uprisings in the US highlight how broken our political economic system is, right? It's broken for workers, it's broken for the climate, and it's especially broken for Black Americans, the Latinx community, and other people of color who've suffered most from the COVID-19 crisis. And the current moment really sort of begs the question, which I hope we can focus on today: will we double down on a neoliberal, market-driven economy that's based on racism, exclusion, worker and environmental exploitation, or will we shift dramatically to building a more inclusive, equitable, fair, and ecologically sustainable economy and society that we need? And so, I feel like this is really both a moment of great peril and great opportunity, right? We could head down this path of greater inequality and a deepening climate crisis that is now almost apparent on a daily basis, or we could shift to building this more inclusive, equitable, and ecologically sustainable society that we need. And I think in order to build this more inclusive, equitable, and ecologically sustainable economy and society, we need the voice and the power of the labor movement. I think that's absolutely essential. And I think we're seeing growing signs of the labor movement playing a positive, proactive role to develop a pro-worker, pro-union climate agenda that can really help address the crisis of climate change and inequality. And I hope that we can talk about that more as well. In terms of why labor's voice and power is so important to this work, I just want to say a few things. One is that the vast majority of clean energy jobs in the US today are non-union. For a few years in a row now, the number one fastest growing jobs in the US are solar and wind installers. It's great to see these industries really taking off. It's exactly what we need to address the climate crisis. Most estimates calculate that we'll need between 25 and 40 million new jobs in the US to decarbonize our economy. And that means building the renewable energy, retrofitting our buildings, improving and expanding public transit, manufacturing electric vehicles, building a dense electric vehicle charging infrastructure. That's a ton of work. And given the current crisis of inequality we're facing, these jobs can't be low-wage, low-quality jobs that exacerbate the crisis of inequality in this country. They need to be high-quality family and community-sustaining jobs that will reduce inequality in the US. Right now, the solar industry is about 3% organized. The wind industry is about 4% union organized, and the unionization rates and energy efficiency are even lower. If you look at parts of the energy sector that have been around for a long time, like natural gas power plants, the unionization rate is close to like 14%. Of course, unions had to fight to make jobs in these existing energy sectors like natural gas power plants better, safer jobs. And the only way that new clean energy jobs will be good jobs, I think, is if the labor movement is involved in developing and shaping the policies to address climate change and make this a priority. And this, and really say this isn't just about reducing emissions, right? We need to do that. That's absolutely critical from a scientific perspective. But, it's also about reducing emissions and creating jobs that allow U.S. families to thrive and making sure that the work is done by highly trained, highly skilled workers that can safely install electrical systems like solar panels on the roofs of our homes. And so I think, it's also important to recognize as we think about this, critical connection between inequality, climate change, the creation of high quality jobs. It's important to recognize that there are many environmental and climate justice groups, largely led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US, that have been pointing out for many years that their communities have been disproportionately affected by pollution, extreme weather events, and that a big part of building a more equitable, ecologically sustainable economy and society is making sure that these communities have first priority and seeing the benefits from building this new clean energy economy, like having good paying union jobs in solar, wind, and other clean energy sectors. So it's another reason that it's so important to make sure that these new clean energy jobs are going to be good jobs and that there is a real commitment and accountability around the communities that have been most affected by climate change and pollution, that they have an effective pathway into union, pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs and good family and community sustaining jobs in these new clean energy sectors. The other thing I'll say about why labor's voice and power is so important to climate work is that the energy transition is already impacting union members. Wind and solar is getting much cheaper. The public is demanding more renewable power, and many power producers and utilities are deciding to shut down coal, oil, gas, and nuclear plants. And since unions have higher unionization rates in these sectors, we've seen thousands of union jobs disappear in the US over the past decade. And as we do more to address the climate crisis and make this massive transition, more jobs in communities connected to these fossil fuel plants and other carbon intensive industries are going to be negatively impacted. And we have to find an effective way to support workers and communities through this transition and make sure that this transition isn't borne on their backs. And we haven't been good in the US about figuring out how to do this so-called just transition for workers and communities. And so this is a big part of why it's so important for labor to really be involved in this work. And Mijin and I have both done a lot of work on this concept called just transition, and can certainly talk about it more if the audience is interested. And then I'll just end by saying, I think as we look at where are the opportunities to build this equitable, fair, racially just, ecologically sustainable society and economy that we need, we definitely need to be paying attention to, if Vice President Biden is elected, a major opportunity to deal with the climate crisis, growing inequality, and the COVID-19 induced economic crisis is going to be this potential $2 to $3 trillion federal infrastructure package. And this could be a major opportunity to drive major public investments into infrastructure spending with a focus on reducing emissions, building up clean energy, and creating high quality family and community sustaining jobs. And we've seen a number of, actually many gigawatts of wind and solar development are currently at risk of being canceled because of the coronavirus and the economic crisis. And so from a jobs and climate perspective, I think we will need major public investment in solar and wind and city and state budgets that cover public transit in order to recover from this crisis. It took the US, about 10 years to recover from the 2008 crisis. And, in many ways, we still haven't, right? And we see the effects through the crisis of inequality that we're facing and the levels of wage stagnation, the levels of unemployment that are persistent in Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So, I think that could be a major opportunity from a climate perspective. We have less than 10 years to drastically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and do what we need to do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That's what science is telling us. This is the most important decade from 2020 to 2030. And that means how we decide to respond to this crisis right now, this kind of intersecting crisis of climate change, COVID-19, this economic crisis, inequality, really has, major long-term impacts for our society and for the planet. And it could mean the difference between, survivable increases in our global average temperature or catastrophic temperature increases if we're not able to make the investments in the clean energy economy that we need and do it in a way that actually addresses inequality. So I'll stop there and happy to have more discussion on all of this and hopefully have a robust Q&A. Thanks.
Lara, that was excellent. And let me just say that, I have so many follow-up questions for you, and I'll be coming back with a few of those. But I want to say, having talked to so many corners of the labor movement, the U.S. labor movement specifically, I think that is such a, awesome, progressive view on things. And this is definitely the direction we need to be going. So thank you. All right, next up, we have a bit of more of a, I think, European perspective to the subject. We're going to have someone who I really love reading his work and who I had the pleasure of meeting in Brussels, and that I think folks should really look into his work if you have a chance. Béla Galgóczi, and he is the European Trade Union Institute, and he is going to be doing what I believe a presentation. Béla, do you have a presentation to share with folks today?
Oh yeah. Hi Larry, thanks a lot. So I would then share a PowerPoint.
Excellent. And do you? Okay, great. We can see that.
Yeah. Okay, so you have it now. Oops.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just go to the beginning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. So what I would like to do here in 8 or 10 minutes, first to draw a parallel between the climate emergency and the COVID crisis, have a little bit the spotlight on the concept of just transition. First of all, how complicated, multidimensional it is, and how much it depends on the context. Why it is a particular challenge for trade unions, mentioning only a few case examples, and then a little bit on the EU policies right now. So that is what I try to push into this couple of minutes. What is clear for everybody that the COVID-19 crisis is an imminent and direct threat. It came overnight. At the same time, the climate crisis is elusive, it is indirect, it is building up year and year and year, and the effects are not necessarily direct and where you are. The effects can be on the other side of the earth and so on. So it is much harder to recognize the urgency, and this is what we are experiencing. There is a different risk, a different link between individual risk and collective risk. In the COVID case, there is a direct link, because if you go out in the street without mask, you know that it's kind of, there is a, well, you are exposed, yeah, but with the climate crisis, it's not. So it is more difficult. At the same time, the challenge is even bigger, and the health risk altogether is bigger. Coordinated action is needed, but it's nowhere near. One concrete danger is that with this current emergency, health and also jobs emergency, in wake of the COVID crisis, there is a re-emergence of the climate jobs dichotomy. Yeah, we saw it long ago. It's back. It's behind us. Yeah, so there is no trade-off between jobs and climate priorities. But when the situation is so difficult and now, then, well, there is a trend to say any jobs here and now. And there are the recovery plans and the big bazookas that are just mostly triggering as soon as back to normal. And this is not the way to go. We need to align these two things, a recovery that is also taking the long-term challenge into account. One important aspect is the rediscovery of the role of the state. The state was written off, particularly in the US, but also in Europe for a long time. Now we rediscover that the state has powers. And I don't want to go as far, but just an analogy, the state can easily shut down restaurants, businesses from one day to another, but it doesn't even come up as an idea to shut down the coal mines and compensate and follow workers and businesses similarly as it is being done for the restaurants, even if there is a health threat of the coal mines equally as probably. So it is just a thought on that. Just transition, really complicated, multidimensional concept. I think it is worth it to look more narrowly the just and the transition part, because everywhere you are, you have a different concept on what is just, and you have a different concept on what is a transition. Certainly the just, the just is much about climate and environmental justice, the global north and south, racial, historical, intergenerational aspects, all that. Then that is the climate and environmental part. But there is also the climate policies that have a distributional effect, affecting different peoples and constituencies very differently, and you need to take care about that. There is the job transition part, how you come from coal and carbon-intensive jobs to a greener economy with all the sectoral specifics, the regional restructuring part. It is very much context dependent. It depends where you are. India is different than Norway, and we have the outcome and the process. The outcome is the vision of the future: zero carbon inclusive society with green and quality jobs. This is where we want to head for. At the same time, one stress was that a green transition should not create more inequality. That is already something. At the same time, a future society should be more equal than what we have. And as third, it happens also that current societies are so having entrenched inequalities that are obstacles of any transformation. So you need to repair those as well. So it's really a complex issue. So what I want to stress here, that just transition processes are taking place in real work environments on the ground. And what happens there at the plants, it is taking place in the context of capital-labor relationship. These are conflictual places. So you need to put these transitions through under conflictual circumstances and managing this change. Trade unions have always been good at managing this change. But while in the past they were managing a change that was driven by profit motive, and they were questioning the rationale of that change. Why you relocate jobs to China or wherever, just to have more profits? In this case, these questions are not really to be raised, because the change, the decarbonization is for a shared objective, it's an interest of humanity. So this, there is no place here to question the rationale of change. So you need to drive the change forward, practically having more ambitious climate policy criteria, stricter CO2 standards, and at the same time defend the workers' interest. So this is a much bigger difficulty for trade unions than in earlier, and that's why, of course, trade union strategies are different, and there's a literature on that: business unionism, social unionism, having a narrow perspective, just the interest of core workers, or a broader perspective, everybody's interest, just transition for all. Then also some authors are talking about transactional trade union approaches or hedging strategies, how they hedge the climate objectives to the imminent job and security objectives. And then we have a dichotomy between higher level trade unions and plant level unions that are normally more cautious with change, and these are also conflicts. I don't have time for cases, but yes, we can look at the core transition in Germany. That is, well, you can say it is perfectly just, but it takes almost 20 years. So it is not just from a climate or an environmental perspective, but it's good for the workers, and it is done in a very balanced way. Other transitions, like the NL company in Italy, were done with social dialogue and with also an outlook for the future of what happens after the closure of these fossil fuel plants. And that was done with social dialogue, with trade unions, with respective agreements, not perfect, but at least a relatively good practice case. The automobile industry had a lot of company level agreements that were positive. At the same time, the automobile industry was not the forerunner of change. Again, at European level or national level, they were always on the brake. Yeah? So slower transition. But now they have to realize that this strategy doesn't work anymore. So the last thing, that the EU at least had a recovery plan that goes along the European Green Deal priorities. So this seems to be a good response coming out of the COVID crisis with green agenda, with green objectives. And for that, there are substantial resources put in the pot. It is also a very positive development that this is the first time the EU agreed on, well, debt mutualization. So this means raising European money that will be used on member state level. So this kind of community approach, it is new, it never happened in the EU, and that is positive. There are also relatively good criteria and priorities, but of course it is so much up to the detail. One danger is that during the cuts, because the original proposal was larger and in the council it had been cut, the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism was one of the biggest victims of the cuts. It had been downscaled to less than a half. And this is indeed a problem, and trade unions also try to fight for better resources and also a better concept, because the Just Transition Fund and the mechanism in Europe is very much concentrated on core regions now. It should be more than just targeting core regions. Thank you. I hope it was not too long.
No, I thought that was perfect. And also, I will have a follow-up question for you on social unionism versus business unionism as you define them.
Looking forward.
Thank you. Excellent. And thank you so much for going a little bit into...
I stopped the sharing?
Yes, please stop your screen share.
Okay.
Okay. And I think that that is a very nice transition from our first speaker and going into a European perspective. Next up, we have Mijin, who is assistant professor for Occidental College and also a fellow at the Worker Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you all for the TSD for organizing this webinar. And it's really an honor to be here alongside Lara and Béla and Jan. and to be with you here today. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about this project that I've been involved with called the Just Transition Listening Project, which has been convened by an organization called the Labor Network for Sustainability that many of you have probably heard of. So the basic, what started out in the beginning was really to think about the fossil fuel transition and the energy transition and try to understand how people are experiencing this transition. But then COVID hit, so we pivoted to also include COVID to really understand, to kind of paint a picture of what was happening to people on the ground. And we wanted to really not talk to leaders and not talk to electeds, but really talk to the people who are experiencing these transitions. To date, we've completed about over 100 interviews across the country with rank and file members and labor unions, community leaders and members, environmental justice advocates, climate justice advocates, and Native American tribal members. This effort has also been accompanied by a series of webinars to try to understand different aspects of just transition. So they've covered things like the history of just transition and the term, the controversy around the term, as Béla mentioned, fancy funeral or radical rebirth, race and just transition and unions and young workers and just transition, etc. So the results, we're now at the stage where we're trying to understand the results and analyze what we found. And the work is preliminary so far, but there are a few important takeaways that I'd like to share. One, as Lara laid out so starkly, is that we understand that COVID is not the great equalizer, as was mentioned when the pandemic started, but is in fact the great magnifier, and that every inequality that is in society has been laid out so starkly and so clearly through the COVID crisis. We can think about it in terms of both who's been infected by COVID, the death rates amongst from COVID. We said that really concentrated amongst communities of color and low-income communities, and for many reasons, right? One is because they are more likely to be doing work that is considered essential, like service sector work, and also they are more likely to live in areas that are polluted, which is particularly challenging for respiratory disease. The other thing that we found, and I think has also been mentioned previously, is that really the role of the state in terms of the role of government. If you can figure out how it works, government can work for you. But what we are seeing now is actually a historic failure of governments, especially in the US, and an inability to meet even the basic needs of individuals across the country. For instance, as I'm sure many of you are aware, our healthcare system is such that your healthcare insurance is tied to your job. And in a global pandemic, when you have mass unemployment, you have millions of people who lose their health insurance during a time of a health crisis. So we really see this need to both restore the faith in government, but also to make government work. What we are seeing is that people don't really know where to turn. And in some ways, we could think of it beneficially because we really see communities and labor and other support systems really stepping up to really help, from very basics of delivering food to helping with finding re-employment and all of those things. But in fact, this is something the state should do, right? These are basic survival things that should be provided by the states. Also because it's not as if these people have stopped paying taxes. So we really see a need to not only restore faith in government, but also to make government work. And there's also a generational shift. And I think this really builds on the work that Maite, Tapia, Lowell Turner, and many others have done about how young workers really see the world much more intersectionally. They are much more concerned about climate change. They are much more concerned about race. And I just want to share a short video, which I think really highlights kind of how young workers really see the climate crisis, which features one of the people that was interviewed for the LNS project and also someone that has worked with Lara in the climate jobs work in Texas. And I'm generally terrible at this, so I'm going to try to, oh, okay, great. So hopefully this will work.
We may have to, is it possible to turn the sound up on that? Folks can see the subtitles at least. Thank you. We didn't have sound there, but we were able to see.
Oh no!
No, it's okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. We can see the subtitles though. I think
there's like this really rousing music.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a fail on my part. But some things that I really like about this video, one is the music, so I would encourage you to watch it again. But two, it's from the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led climate movement. And I like that you really see different tactics being used now. I think the ad is very aggressive, right? And I think it really owns the narrative of not only climate change, but that unions have a play in climate change. And more than that, that they should be at the table. As the IBEW worker says, if unions are not at the table, they're on the menu. And I feel like it's just advancing a narrative that we really haven't seen from labor on such a wide scale. I think it's really exciting and encouraging, and I see that as the direction kind of as labor is moving. And so just to wrap up quickly, moving forward, out of this process has come also a labor climate COVID initiative that has really brought labor and climate together, and they've just filed a lawsuit on behalf of essential workers. The environmentalists also working with the workers. There'll be a report issued next year, early, with our findings, and then hopefully we're hoping to have some congressional hearings that will bring these people who have been testifying and who have given us their stories to Congress. And the last thing I'll say is that, we're really trying to understand what we're trying to really understand and internalize and also externalize is that we are already in transition. We often talk about just transition as something in the future, but in fact, we are both transitioning to a world where climate change occurs, and we are transitioning to a post-COVID world. So as Lara mentioned, this is really a pivotal moment where we either invest in the, polluting industries and economy of the past, or we really invest in a clean energy, thriving future forward that will bring prosperity for workers and families across the country. So thank you. And I'm going to drop a link to the video in the chat because the music is so great. And I'm really sorry that you couldn't hear the sound.
No, it was an excellent presentation. And thank you for drawing such a stark choice that is to be made. I think that's really, really great transition. And I'll just say that, I see some questions in the chat here. Please hang on. I think we're going to probably get to those questions after the last presenter first. And then I'll have a couple follow-up questions for the speakers after that. So our next speaker is coming from the Europe side, and this is Philipp Rohde, who is Policy Officer for Environment, Climate, and Sustainability at the German Trade Union Confederation, aka DGB. Welcome, Jan.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, Larry. Just to give you a short overview about the DGB. So we are the German Trade Union Confederation. Our affiliates are the sectoral trade unions. We're organizing people and workers from each sectors, coming from the public side to the transport, heavy industries, also the police is organized. We are one of our main topic is the just transition, and I would like to give you a short overview about our concept of just transition, and then I would like to talk about the Coal Commission. I think Béla was also mentioning it. I think it's a good example of how we managed a just transition for workers in Germany. And afterwards, I would like to give a short view what we see on the European level coming from the COVID crisis and the recovery plan. So for us, there are four main pillars that are very important when it comes to just transition. The first one is that workers are key to the transition. So that means that workers, on the one hand, they are affected by the transition, but on the other hand, they are drivers for the sustainable development. They know their company's best and they're expert when it comes to innovation solution to decarbonize their companies. So it's very important to put them at the core of the transition. And what we use in Germany to support the workers and to let them hear the voices also on the company level is that we have strong social dialogues and also tariffs and co-determination measures on a company's level, especially in the heavy industry and in the high carbon intensive industries. So they are very well co-determinated sectors where workers can directly influence transition within their companies. So therefore, it's very important to strengthen collective bargaining agreements and also to strengthen co-determination measures. And as Lara already said, we have this good high-quality standard jobs in the so-called alt industry and the alt sectors, but we're missing, and we've seen a lack of collective bargaining agreements and co-determination in the new sectors. So it's very important for us that the new jobs are also good jobs, and our affiliates try hard to organize in those sectors, but it's not that easy. So we are calling also when it comes to funds for renewables, for instance, that those funds are directly linked to good labor standards, and that the workers have a say when it comes to public funds. So the second part is that the leave no one behind concept. So as we see in Germany, but I think it's a worldwide problem, that the structural change and also the COVID-19 crisis, they're affecting regions, industries, companies, workers, and especially those who are already affected by structural change. And it's very important for us that those people and those regions have a voice in the transformation process. And we did those process with the Coal Commission. I will talk later about it, but it was very important for us that those voices are heard when it comes to finding solutions and finding acceptable pathways, and to create feasible perspectives together with those affected regions and workers. The third part is about the political framework which is needed. We already heard that it's absolutely not acceptable to leave the structural change and the transition to the market. So for us, our opinion is that the structural change has actively shaped by governments in cooperation with trade unions and also with employers. And we see when the market is leading those processes, that those results are increasing the risk of social and environmental dumping instead of a comprehensive package, and instead of a sustainable framework to fulfill our targets. And what we see as an important issue is there as well, is that it needed a comprehensive strategy, including labor market policies, social policies, innovational policies, structural, industrial, and regional policies. So it's not only about climate policies, but also on a really active shaped policies, like an overall approach. And the last point for us, that's very, very, very important, is investment for climate protection, but also for prosperity and decent work. And what we're calling for is a huge investment program in modernization of companies, but also into climate-friendly infrastructure, innovative technologies in the building sector, but also in the mobility sector. So on the one hand, you need to transform the industries and to transform the companies where the workers are. But on the other hand, you need also to build up infrastructure to give alternatives for climate-friendly behavior. So those four elements are our main priorities when it comes to a just transition. Now let me give you a short insight in what happens in Germany with the Coal Commission. So the Coal Commission was a commission established by the federal government 2 years ago. And what happened was, in Germany, we saw that we won't reach our energy climate targets. And the government decided not to come up with their own aims and targets, and they decided to set up a commission with all the relevant stakeholders. So trade unions were on board in this commission, but also scientists, the environmental side, companies, businesses, but also the officials from the government. So it was an overall approach with all relevant stakeholders, and negotiated over nearly 6 months and created reliable pathways to end the coal, or to finding a feasible path for ending the coal production and the coal energy. And I would say other way than Béla said, of course, it's a long term. So the result is that the coal-fired power generation will end in 2038 with an option to shut down early in 2035. But it's also within this consensus that the energy targets in Germany will be met by this coal consensus. So it's not a linear, but close to a linear shutdown pathway. But it was not only about the climate and energy targets, but it was also about structural change. And the members also negotiated about what's happened with the workers. And that was our main approach, that we said that no workers should left alone, and therefore this coal consensus is highlighting that there should be an adequate social protection for workers, such as compensation of lost wages, pension deduction, but also adjustment allowances as a bridge for early retirement. So all workers in the sectors are secure. The second pillar is that there will be structural funds for the affected regions. So over a period of 20 years, there will be 2 billion euros spent per year to help those affected regions to create new industrial clusters, to invest in infrastructure in those regions, to create some alternatives for the future, and create new industrial but climate friendly there. And from our point of view, it was a successful approach to bringing all stakeholders together. It was hard discussions. There was a lot of different views and approach, but I think in the end it was something that each group could at least be okay with. So I think it was a good way to see how a just transition and those kind of dialogue could work. And let me say something about the recovery plan we see in Europe, but also in Germany. The German government was quite early with their reaction, and they decided to spend 130 billion euro for recovery measures. And we also were strong involved in how to which sectors and what kind of measures should be used. And 40 billions out of this 130 billions will be directly spent into climate-friendly measures. So it was very important for us to link the COVID crisis directly to the structural change we are facing, to bring both together as a chance. And that was also our strategy when it comes to the European measures and the European Recovery Fund. And as Béla said, it's also linked the European Recovery Fund to the Green Deal approach. And a lot of the money we will spend for recovery measures will also be spent for environmental friendly measures. But I think that's also a very important point from us. We say that all European and also the national spending should be directly linked to criteria, environmental and also social criteria. So they have to follow both dimensions, and they should strengthen decent work. So I will stop now and see to a fruitful discussion. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for laying that out. We are at the question section. I want to give you a quick follow-up since I've got you here, Jan. Was it a big fight to get that 4 billion directed towards climate recovery measures? Politically, was it a big fight for the Confederation?
we had this fight even within the German trade union movement, because there's a difference when it comes to short time recovery measures and the mid to long term transition processes. So we had this huge debate also within the trade union movement, but decided to at least that those investments should not hinder the transition. So, but more pushing the transition forward. So, yes and no.
Excellent, thank you. Pardon, I have a few questions here in the chat. The first one is to Lara. How do ideas of slow growth and degrowth fit in with ideas of just transition?
Yeah, that's a good question, Larry, and to the audience member who asked that. I'm really sympathetic to the arguments that the health and well-being of our society should be evaluated on other criteria than economic growth and gross domestic product, GDP. And I think, many have pointed out over time that the only times we've seen significant global reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are during times of economic crisis, right? We saw reductions during the 2008 economic crisis, and then we've seen some modest reductions during this COVID-19 induced economic crisis. That said, I think the main factor around whether we build a more equitable society that operates within the bounds of the planet's ecological and climate limits is really a question of power, political and social and cultural power. And will we have the social movement power to make this shift and demand the society that we need that's really focused on, allowing people to have the health and well-being and quality of life that they need. And I think at this point in time, I feel like the focus really needs to be on how labor can build broad alliances with other social movements. I think that's most important. We're going to need a broad, diverse, inclusive, and powerful social movement calling for climate, racial, economic, and worker justice. And, given the legitimate concerns labor has about the transition, how much job loss it will cause, I think it's important for us to focus on how we can seize the opportunities that crisis presents and, build a movement around it, build that social movement that's calling for climate, economic, and worker justice. For me, I just feel like that's kind of the most important focus right now, to build that social movement power, to get to a place where we can have a more meaningful conversation about the sort of ecological and climate limits of the planet.
Excellent. And that leads really well into a question I have for Mijin. Mijin, the video that you showed, it showed a few conversations, I think, between IBEW and some climate organizers. And in your speech, you mentioned the Green New Deal. Can you reflect a bit on, where you are, on the Green New Deal and the concept of a new green economy in the U.S., given the political climate and the rise of the of kind of right-wing radicalism, and how that is affecting the work, if it is affecting the work for you?
That's a great question, Larry. And I feel like one of the things that I really like about that video from Sunrise is that, especially in the US, we just started living in such dark times. And it's really hard to find any kind of optimism. And so when you see something like that, that is produced, by young people, that features, the next generation of labor leaders, I think it's really exciting. And I think, one of the things I think that's really important about the Green New Deal is that, one, it's just a framework, so it's not prescriptive and it's not fully fleshed out. It's really something we're undertaking. And two, it really, breaks climate out of these silos. For a long time, the climate movement was just about emissions reductions. It was just about carbon dioxide, and it didn't talk about social and economic issues, right? They rejoiced when fracking was banned in places, which I understand, but also we have to also understand that those people don't have any opportunities except for fracking. And people should not be placed in a situation where they have to choose between a job and their a clean environment. So, I don't think we can dismiss or we were talking, briefly before the panel started about the state of the election. I think the Republicans will do everything they can to steal the election. But the thing that I really liked at the end of that video is when they say they may not know our names, but they will know our power. And I think what is really exciting is this idea of the reframing of it, where it is about building power. And as Lara mentioned, the more people we have on board, the more power we have. And eventually we will have enough power to start to make meaningful change.
Excellent. And I think one of the most interesting things that Béla mentioned was that this moment has introduced the rediscovery of the power of the state. Béla, can you give a little bit more definition on what you mean by that? And also, I think this question, it also goes very well to Jan, so feel free to respond to this as well. What can the United States learn from Germany in particular, but some of the European member states, in terms of how you've been handling the crisis and how you've been, moving towards green policy for workers? Béla, I think if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Oh, well, I think that's quite hard. But first of all, what I would like to say is that really what we experience now is a huge emergence of the power of the state, that the state has tools, first of all, a lot of money that can be used, which was a taboo in previous times, to get indebted and spend it for investments, public investments, and for the public good and for future projects. In particular, in Germany, it was a huge taboo with their Black Zero doctrine. Yeah, that no knew that at all, and this had been revised. It was, and it is. We know that the green transformation has a tremendous investment need, and even if large-scale investment projects are already planned within the European Green Deal and also in the recovery package, these are by far not on the scale that would have been necessary. But we see that the state is able to mobilize a lot of resources. So this is kind of an example to build on. The other thing is the regulatory power of the state, that, well, we shouldn't go into lockdowns. And certainly this is the last thing anybody wants. And particularly in terms of the climate change. Because, of course, we can reach a zero carbon economy with a full lockdown. That's for sure. Yeah? So it's just have this in mind. We cannot go that way, but to avoid that way, the state is certainly capable of regulation. I just remember, again, a German example. I remember in Germany, it was a taboo to speak about a speed limit on the motorway. Germany is the only country in the world that has no speed limit. And it was unthinkable. How can the state come so far to limit your freedom on the motorway? And now, after all these interventions in the COVID, well, maybe a general question come up: why not have a speed limit on the motorway? So this kind of regulatory issues could also come up.
That's very, very interesting. It sounds very similar to some conversations we're having in the States these days about individual freedom versus collective responsibility, which I think you mentioned in your presentation. I just want to check in. Ian, can we go over just a few minutes here? Do you have any space?
Sure, we can go over a few minutes.
Okay, hopefully folks can hang on with this because this is really interesting. So I wanna go back to Jan for just a moment for his response. I have a question in the chat for Lara, and then I'm gonna give Mijin the last word here. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Béla, I don't want to disappoint you, but I think the speed limit is still not on the table in Germany, so I think we can't talk about that.
Hope it comes.
Maybe when it, maybe, but yeah, we're talking about decarbonize the mobility sector. So yeah, we need to find some solutions there as well. You're absolutely right. But what we see in Germany, but also on a European level, is that multilateralism is more important than ever. So what we saw and still see during the pandemic is that the supply chain and all the economy are very heavy interlinked in Europe and across the world. and therefore you need a joint and a common response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that was also not quite new, but that the Europeans had on an early stage such a strong statement with the recovery plan, or the idea of a recovery plan, that was quite or I didn't expect that. So I think even on the European level, there was some shifting in mind or shifting in thinking that it needs to be organized on a higher level, on a European level, and not left to the member states alone. And I think what was very important was Béla said is that it's a shift to investment strategies and not focusing on austerity policy anymore. And I think that was the most or the biggest mistake Europe was made after the big finance crisis, the austerity policy. And I think there was a rethinking what we're seeing right now to really invest into the future, and also to allow a deficit spending combined with an jointly approach.
Excellent, thank you. And Lara, we have another question for you. You made an important point about how we must strive towards an equitable, sustainable society, and how we need the labor movement to get there. At the same time, we know that Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, as the most impacted communities, have been organizing for a long time, often outside the traditional labor movement. If we want the unions to be central in this transition towards an equitable society, what are the challenges they need to overcome? What changes do you think need to be made in terms of their leadership, strategy, bargaining, and scope, et cetera? And I think that's about the labor movement specifically.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that question, Maite. I mean, I'll say a few things, really specifically on the labor climate piece. I think for a long time, labor positioned itself, as, staying neutral or even opposing climate protection efforts, simply because, it felt like climate protection efforts were really attacks on union jobs, and that unions would see significant job loss as we made this transition to this clean energy economy. And I think now we're seeing many parts of the labor movement in the U.S. reposition unions, and I'm seeing this in my own work. We're partnering with the Climate Jobs National Resource Center and supporting the labor movement in many states that are now trying to develop a more positive, proactive approach to climate work. And really concretely make these links between inequality and climate change, and figure out how do you seize the opportunities and how do you address the concerns. Those concerns are there, they're not going to go away like just transition, but we can figure out a way to address them, but also seize the tremendous opportunity as we try to tackle these crises of climate change and inequality. So I think that's really important. And I think as labor gets more engaged in the debates around climate and clean energy, for example, on just transition, we've supported a number of unions who've gone through plants being closed down, coal, oil, or gas, or nuclear plants being closed down as we address climate change. And, honestly, through that work, the labor movement sees, it's the teachers union, it's the police, it's the firefighters union, it's AFSCME, the public sector workers union, who are often more impacted than the workers who work at the plant by the shutdown, because so much of the community is based around those plants. So much of the tax base for the local community comes from those power plants. So, as they get more engaged, they realize that it's not just, workers who are impacted by this transition, but it's communities too. And we really have to figure out how we're both protecting and supporting workers and communities through these transitions. And partnering, again, to the piece around social movement building and power building, partnering with allies to really make sure that this transition is going to be equitable. And then more broadly about, changes within the labor movement, I just think if we want to build a more ecologically sustainable, more racially and economically just society, then we need to, embrace that within the labor movement too. And, I've been really encouraged by the number of unions like the painters union, like the teachers union, who have really been active in speaking out against the killing of George Floyd and many other Black Americans, and putting out statements, to address white supremacy in this country. And I think, embracing that in our own movement and figuring out how we can make our own unions more racially just is a big part of how we build this broader, more diverse and inclusive movement that we know we need to achieve worker and economic justice. So I'm encouraged by, some unions taking more action there. And of course, there's always more for us to do, but I think that's going to be a big piece of us being able to build the movement that we need.
That's excellent. And I can say that there's so many people from different backgrounds who are interested in this type of work and really don't know about the power that can be built through the labor movement. I can say I really had no idea personally about the labor movement, but there's a very small leap between the civil rights movement and the labor movement, and there's so much shared history there. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. Mijin, can you please give your reaction to what Lara said, and your own take on that?
I mean, I in general just always agree with what Lara says.
Good strategy.
Yeah. I mean, come on. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, just one thing I would add is that, we often talk about labor as if it's this amorphous thing out there. But in fact, workers are community members, they live in communities that will be impacted by climate change. They are people of color, we tend to kind of separate them from ourselves as like, well, there's labor and then there is environments. Well, we're all in it together. And I think, we really are seeing some changes. I really do think, we've said this often, many times before, but we really are at a pivoting moment where either we come together and we build this multiracial, multi-class movements, right, that really understands that social and economic issues are fundamental to the climate crisis, or we double down on this exploitive, extractive economy. And when we think of extraction, it's not just resources, right? It's people, it's wealth, it's individuals, it's the carceral states. And we are really at this moment of crisis, I think. And I think crisis makes people scared. And I think this is where we can come together and find strength in each other and solidarity in each other. And through that strength and solidarity, we then build power. To your point, Larry, about the civil rights movement, right? It's like we come together. You stand up for somebody whose interests are different than yours. And you stand with them, and together we build. And that's, I really honestly think that's the only way forward.
Absolutely, and that's so much more clear now. And this past year, I want to acknowledge has been not only really difficult in terms of COVID, but it happened right along with the racial unrest in the States. And it's been a double impact that's been very heavy, specifically for people of color and specifically for Black folks. So it's so amazing to have both you and Lara speaking on this so powerfully. And I hope we can do more conversations like this in different spaces. And I'll be thinking through how we can do that. I really want to close us out and give Béla the last word here. There was a little bit of discussion around degrowth, and I'm wondering if, Béla, you can shine some light on that.
Thank you. It's a very long topic and would deserve an own seminar. So I can only say one word, and the one word is probably saying that, we have to face the fact that the growth we had in the last couple of decades and even before that was not benefiting workers at all, but it was destructing the environment. At the same time, the equation is unfortunately not that easy to say that if we scrap growth, everything would be fine. So there is no reverse relationship that without growth, we would have more equality. So it's a tremendous task to correct the current, the growth model or the economic model. And then in the longer run, of course, it can be degrowth or no growth, but the most important thing is to address the inequality issue. And certainly once we arrive in a stage where there is definitely no growth or even degrowth, then we need to think about a total redistribution of working time, for example, across the whole population. It is a tremendous task. We were not even managing smaller changes in working time management, but then you have to redistribute everything. So it would be a tremendous task, yeah, but maybe it will come. But first we need to address current inequalities. That's the most important thing. And of course, address the climate crisis as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, that is quickly.
Thank you for giving us that frame. I'm so grateful to have been able to guide this discussion, and I learned a ton. I hope you did too. I just want to encourage folks to continue to join these webinars and be a part of the conversation. We're going to be talking more about these subjects in the coming weeks, and thank you for joining our talk.